I sat down very slowly across from him. He had been in a relationship at 23 with a woman he had cared about seriously, the first serious relationship of his life. She had become pregnant. The circumstances were complicated in the way that circumstances in Iran are complicated for unmarried people in that situation, which is to say they were dangerous as well as personally difficult. The relationship ended under pressure from both families. The woman, her name was Nasreen, moved to a different city. She raised the child with help from her family. And as far as the world outside that family was concerned, there was no father in the picture. Dariush had known. He had sent money through back channels for years, irregularly, in the way of someone doing what they could within the constraints available. He had not been part of Shireen's life in any visible way because in the circumstances of their country at that time being part of her life, visibly was not something that could happen without serious consequences for Nasreen. Shireen was now 34. Nasreen had died the previous year, a sudden illness. And after her death, Shireen had found letters and documents that told her what she had always partially known and now knew completely. She had contacted Dariush. They had been in careful, tentative communication for 8 months. He had not told me because he did not know how, and because every month that passed made the not telling feel more serious, and because he was afraid in the specific way of people who have been carrying something for so long that the carrying has become part of how they understand themselves, and putting it down feels like losing a layer of skin. I did not react the way I thought I would react. I had imagined in the abstract that discovering a secret of this magnitude about my husband would produce rage, the kind that fills a room and needs to go somewhere. What I felt instead was something quieter and in some ways more frightening, a kind of vertigo, like the ground had not quite given way, but had shifted enough that I couldn't find my footing. I had chosen this man based on months of conversation and 5 days in Melbourne and a year of building a life, and I had believed I knew the important things about him, the shape of his interior, the dimensions of his history, and here was a dimension I had not been given. I told him I needed time. He said, of course. I went for a very long walk along the river by myself, and I stayed out until it was dark, which in Melbourne in autumn happens early, and I sat on a bench and I thought about what I actually felt underneath the vertigo, because the vertigo was real, but it was not the whole thing. Underneath, it was something I had to be honest about, which was that I understood, not excused, but understood the impossible position he had been in at 23 in a country where the options for people in that situation were not the options available to people in Melbourne. And I understood, though it cost me something to admit it, that the secret had been kept not from selfishness, but from a fear that was entirely understandable, even when the keeping of it was not. I came home. I told him that I was not leaving, that I did not want to leave, that what he had done was serious and had damaged something between us that was going to take time and honesty to repair. And then I told him that I wanted to know about Shireen, not to decide anything, not to perform a generosity I didn't feel yet, but because she existed, and she was real, and she had just lost her mother, and she had found a father at 34, and I thought that those facts deserved to be treated seriously rather than managed around. He told me about her over several evenings. She was an architect trained in Tehran, working on urban restoration projects. She was serious and private and had her mother's face, he said, from photographs, and something in the way she wrote that he recognized as himself. She had not asked him for anything except the truth, and in that, she reminded me of Tomas showing up at someone else's door, though that is not my story to tell. I asked Darius if he wanted a relationship with her. He said he didn't know what he deserved. I said that wasn't the question I had asked. He said yes. He thought she deserved a father who showed up. Even this late, even at 34, we went to therapy, which in Melbourne is an unremarkable and practical thing to do, and which helped us say things to each other in a room with a witness in ways that were more useful than trying to say them alone in our apartment, where the furniture held too much of the previous conversations. Our therapist was a woman named Dr. Amini, Iranian-Australian, which I had not planned, but which meant there was no translation required for certain things, which turned out to matter. She helped Darius understand what it meant to carry a secret in a marriage, not just the fact of it, but the texture of it, the way it fills space and leaves less room for everything else. She helped me understand that the anger I felt was legitimate and also not the whole story of how I felt, that the whole story was more complicated and more livable than anger alone would suggest. Darius flew to Tehran 6 months after that kitchen table conversation. He met Shireen in person for the first time at a cafe near the university where she worked. He was gone for 8 days. He called me every evening from the hotel, late, after he had spent the day in a process of meeting someone who was his and a stranger simultaneously, which I think is one of the stranger experiences a person can have and for which there is no real preparation. He told me things she had said and things they had seen, and small details about her apartment and her way of ordering coffee and how she looked at things, and I listened and I understood that whatever complicated thing I was watching from a distance was real and was not going to go away, and that I had to decide what my relationship to it was going to be. He came home. He walked through the door from the airport looking like someone who has been through something significant and is still processing what it was. I made tea, which is the Iranian response to everything, and which I had adopted completely after enough years in this life. We sat together and I asked him how it had gone. He talked for 2 hours. He said at one point, "She asked about you, about what you were like. I told her you were the most honest person I had ever met." I looked at him. He said, "I told her that you knew and that you had chosen to stay and that it was because of you that I was able to come." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "That's a lot of credit to give someone who spent 3 weeks being very angry with you." He said, "You were angry and you stayed and you asked about her? That's not nothing. That's almost everything. Shireen and I have spoken once by video call 6 months ago. It was careful and slightly awkward and entirely real. She spoke in the mix of Farsi and English, that Iranians of her generation use, and I replied in the same, and we talked about architecture and about Melbourne and about the restoration project she was working on in Old Tehran, stabilizing buildings that had been neglected for decades, bringing back what could be brought back, and acknowledging what couldn't. At the end of the call, she said in Farsi, "Thank you for allowing this." I said the thanks wasn't mine to receive, that he was her father regardless of what I did or didn't allow. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, but it matters how the people around us treat the true things." It changes whether the true things can live. I have thought about that sentence many times since. Darish and I are still in Melbourne. I am in my 3rd year of the fellowship, which has been extended. He found work with an engineering consultancy that does projects across Southeast Asia, and that has given him the international scope he was looking for. We have been talking about children in the honest way, without the pressure of timelines, understanding what we are to each other more fully now than we did in the 1st year of the marriage, when everything was still surface and promise, and we had not yet been tested. My parents came to visit again last spring. My father walked around the university campus again, and this time did not try to hide how proud he was, which made me cry in a way I had not expected. I told my mother in the kitchen while she was reorganizing my spice drawer about Shireen. She stopped what she was doing and turned around and looked at me. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How do you feel about it?" I thought about the question honestly before answering. I said I felt like I was learning that the people we choose contain more than we can see at first, and that loving someone means being willing to discover the more and decide what to do with it, rather than pretending the more isn't there. My mother looked at me for a moment, and then she turned back to the spice drawer. She said, "Your father always said you were the daughter who would go furthest. He meant the distance." She paused, "But I think he meant more than that. I still call Isfahan every Sunday. The connection is sometimes clear and sometimes not, and my mother's voice comes to me across the distance with a slight delay that international calls have, a half-second gap between her speaking and my hearing. That means I am always receiving her, a moment after she has said something, always slightly behind. I have stopped finding this frustrating. It seems right somehow that love crosses distance with a small delay, that it takes a moment to travel the space between where someone is and where you are, and that it arrives anyway. It always arrives. In the evenings when the Melbourne light is doing that thing it does in autumn, going gold, and then suddenly gone, I sometimes stand at the kitchen window and think about all the distances I have traveled, from Isfahan to Melbourne, from the person I was at 26 to the person I am now, from the surface of a marriage to the complicated and more honest version of it that exists underneath. None of it went the way I planned. Almost all of it turned out to contain more than I expected. And the more it turns out is where everything real lives.